Hey guys, my name is Matt Evans. I work at YSU Campus Rec at the Rockwall, and I'm going to teach you a few tips with adventure photography today. So first, let's go over a little bit about me. I started photography a little more serious in 2016. I actually started on an iPhone 7. This picture right here was taken with one. I didn't get my first real camera until 2018. This one down here I took in DC last year. And then earlier this year, in about January, I got an EOS RP, which is actually what I'm filming on right now. I always like to watch photography and editing, Photoshop, all those kind of things on YouTube. That's where I've learned most of my stuff. I've never had any actual training in photography. A lot of my experience, or my photos, just come from experience. I do have experience shooting landscapes, events, like our climbing competitions down at the Rockwall, swim meets, and I've started working a little more with portraits recently. These pictures here, just a sample of some of the pictures that we're going to go over how to compose, how to get the proper exposure, all that kind of stuff, a little bit of editing. Nothing too hard, just a little bit of the basics. Alright, before we get into going over how to take a picture and how to properly expose one and compose and all that stuff, we're going to go over the different types of cameras that are out there. So first you have the point and shoot cameras. These ones, they have basic features. You don't have a lot of control over what you're doing. It's good if you just want to go out and take some pictures real quick, but you don't have a lot of editing capabilities with those either. Next, the smartphone. A lot of smartphones today have really good cameras on them, but again, like point and shoot, there's not much you could do with them after that. Then let's see, what we're going to focus on in this class are DSLR and mirrorless. Their features are about the same. Mirrorless is just a little bit thinner, a little bit smaller. Like this camera, that's a mirrorless camera. This is a DSLR. They're the most flexible, but also the most expensive, but you have a lot of control over pretty much everything in your picture. So some DSLR basics. When shooting, you're trying to create a balanced exposure, unless you're trying to go for a certain effect, like an overexposed picture with a lot of bright spots, or an underexposed with a lot of shadows. A balanced exposure means that there are no areas that are too bright or too dark, and you're going to do that by using the exposure meter right here. Pretty much all cameras have it. If not, you could turn it on somewhere in the settings. The light meter should read 0 whenever it's balanced right here. It's going to be in the center. So to create a balanced exposure, you're going to keep 3 things in mind. You're going to keep the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. And in the later slides, we're going to go over those in detail. Alright, so the first piece of exposure is aperture. And aperture is how big the lens is open. As you can see in this picture here, the smaller the aperture number on the camera, the bigger the hole is letting light in. So a small number of an f1.4 allows in more light than an f22. So as you can see down here, f4 is a big opening, then this picture is up to 16 with a small opening. So the small aperture gives a shorter depth of field with bokeh. That's the background blurriness. You can see that over here in the pictures we have right here, how this was shot at an f1.8, so this background is nice and blurred. This was an f16, where you could see the bottles in focus and these mountains in the background too. And to keep the exposure the same, we had to adjust the other settings here, which we're going to go over in the next slide, which is shutter speed. Shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second or whole seconds, depending on which side of the balance you're going on. So a fast exposure is 1/1000th. It freezes motion, allows in less light. A long exposure, for example, is about a second or anything above. It allows in a lot of light. So any camera movement that occurs during a long exposure will create a blur effect, kind of like how we have down here. This was created with a sparkler. Someone stood and spun in a circle while moving a sparkler in a twirling motion. Let's see, additionally, light trails, that's what I just said down here, light trails. So this was shot at 250th of a second, so it's really dark, where this was 1/10 of a second, so it let in a lot more light. And nothing else was changed on the settings, so that's why one picture is dark and one is bright. The last piece of exposure is ISO. This is the camera sensitivity to light. A low ISO means that you are less sensitive to light, and a higher ISO means you're more sensitive to light. So this picture was shot at 100 ISO and 1/30th of a second, where here we are shot at 6400 ISO and 2,000th of a second. So you see 1/30th is a lot longer than 1/2000th, and that was compensated with 6400 ISO. But the one downside to using a high ISO is the noise you get in the background, where it'll give you more grain, more pixelation. You can see it more whenever the picture is blown up or you try to crop into it. So you always want to try to shoot for the lowest ISO as possible. Alright, now we're going to talk about focal length. That's how the lenses are measured for DSLRs. They go by millimeter sizes. So the lower the millimeters, the wider the picture. So as you can see here in this example, 70 millimeters, you're zoomed out pretty far. But as you increase the millimeters up closer to 400, you get more zoomed in. You can see those birds in a lot more detail than you can over here at 70. So this is an example of a zoom lens here. It's a 75 to 300. And how they work, you twist them and it zooms. And it has an indicator to tell you which level you're at right here. Zoom lenses, they're more flexible because they have more focal lengths, but they don't have the highest aperture to allow in a lot of light, like you can do with a prime lens. This here is a prime lens. It's a 50 millimeter prime lens, and it does not zoom or anything, it just has a focus ring on it. So one nice thing about prime lenses is the maximum aperture, like I talked about. It allows in more light and blurs the background more. The only downside is you have to move yourself further or closer to the subject, depending on what you're trying to do. Another thing that should be considered whenever you're buying a new camera is if it's crop sensor or full frame. A full frame camera is usually a little bit more expensive than the crop sensors, but it also gives you a bigger picture. So as you can see here in these examples, a full frame camera gives you this entire image, where a crop sensor, you're only capturing the very middle of it because the lens doesn't sit over the entire sensor, it's just the middle of it. So you can see here in this one too. And then down here in the actual picture, you can see the crop sensor is actually smaller and less exposed than this one where the lens would cover the entire picture. So some advantages to full frame sensors, they typically allow a higher dynamic range, which means you're going to get more colors in your pictures, and you have better low light capabilities because you're letting in more light. Crop sensors typically have a 1.6 crop factor, so that means that the images are going to be 1.6 times zoomed in. So if you're using a 50 millimeter camera on a crop sensor, it's going to be like you're using an 80 millimeter lens on a full frame. So with the crop sensor, you might have to try moving away yourself. It's like using a prime lens like we just went over. You might have to move yourself or the subject a little bit further away if you're using a crop sensor because it's going to zoom in that little bit. One thing I like to consider before I even start shooting pictures is what file I am saving the files to on my camera. Two common ones whenever you're taking pictures is RAW and JPEG. RAW files are much larger, but they give you a lot more flexibility whenever you're editing. You can bring out the highlights more or the shadows. It has a lot more information stored in the file. JPEGs are good for whenever you're exporting them out of whatever software you're editing them in, but if you shoot in JPEG, you don't have as much flexibility whenever you are editing. So what I like to do over here, I have listed, I always shoot in RAW, and then I always save that RAW file somewhere on a hard drive so I can always go back and re-edit pictures. It allows me to just keep everything original if I wanted to go back and re-edit something, but then I export everything in JPEG just because it's smaller and it doesn't take up so much space. So next, we're on to composition. That's the fun part of photography where you actually get to set up your camera or hold it where you want it, align everything, get it to look exactly how you want it. There's not a lot I could tell you what to do because it's really up to the photographer. Whatever you want to do, whatever you want to create, it's up to you. But there's some tips I can give you to kind of what I go through whenever I'm creating a picture. So this first one here, I'm using a workout ring hanging on the beach to frame this Ferris wheel, so it kind of draws your attention to the center of the screen and you're looking through something into another object. So that's a lot of times I use that to kind of use lines or different objects to bring the viewer's attention to something. Next, you could use the bokeh like we talked about a few slides back to make your subject stand out, how this background is really blurry, so really all you're looking at are these flowers right here in the front. Another technique I use a lot is the not perfectly centered in the middle subject. So you can see the subject is these flowers right here, and they're off to the side. I don't perfectly center everything all the time. I know I did in these ones, but That's something I like to do a lot. Another thing, these two are both the same location, but changing where you stand or the angle you hold a camera can make it look like a completely different place. Where this is straight on, it's kind of boring. You can't see a lot of the different angles of it. Where here, if you go on the corner of something, you might see something from a different view and it might look better or worse. It just depends on what you're going for. And last, this is kind of another thing that I used to direct attention. I had a string of lights that I had wrapped around this person's hands, and I held it up to the lens. As I was holding the camera, I held the lights right here by the lens. So it kind of directs your attention straight down into where the glitter is being blown out of the hands here. One of the last things we're going to talk about in this clinic is editing. Photo editing, that's one of my favorite parts of the whole process of taking photos. You could do whatever you want. You don't have to edit if you don't want to. If you take a picture and you like it exactly how you took it, you could leave it. That's completely up to you. You can see here on the screen an original picture. This is just a palm tree, nothing too special, but you can see there's not too much detail in the shadows here. But because I shot it in RAW, like I just talked about, I was able to bring up the shadows, and you can see more detail here in the dark areas. And it also, if you wanted to edit something with more style, you could crop it however you want. You can add different colors, all different things. This was all done in Lightroom. That's my favorite program I use for photo editing. It has everything I need, and it's not very expensive. I pay a monthly fee for it, but it's definitely worth it for all the pictures I take. And if there's things that I don't understand, there's a lot of tutorials on YouTube that can go over how to do things, so that's why I like it also, because if you don't know something, it's easy to look it up, because so many people are using it. Alright, and here we have some extras, or just a few things that make your pictures a little bit easier to take, or you can get different effects, different styles, all different things with these different tools that you could use to add to your camera. So first, we're going to talk about a couple of filter things that you could fit onto the end of your lens. This here, I have one like this one that's pictured, a variable ND filter. It's a neutral density filter. It's pretty much like a pair of sunglasses that you put on your lens. So you just take your lens and you screw it on like that, and it allows you to take long exposures in brighter sunlight. That's how people get the waterfalls that look like they're all just one stream of water. You don't freeze any motion because it's a long exposure. Then there's also polarizing filters, which I don't have one myself, but it helps to eliminate reflections in water or on glass. You can see here on the pictures. Another thing that I like to use is a tripod. That's how the camera is being held right now. It's sitting on a tripod a lot like this bigger one here. But I also have this GorillaPod, which I use. It's good because it bends all over the place and you can hook it to pretty much anything, anywhere. Tripods are useful in low light too, so that you don't get the camera shake whenever you're using a low shutter speed. And the last thing that I like to use is an external flash. You could aim it different ways, you could adjust the different power on it, and it allows you to take a lot of different styles of pictures, especially with portraits. And a lot of the higher end cameras don't even have a flash with them. You have to buy an external one if you want to use a flash. Alright, that brings us to the end of the photo clinic. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to let me know. This is my photography Instagram listed right here. Send me a message on there if there's anything you want to know or want to know more about or anything like that. I'm always open to answering any kind of questions or giving any kind of tips. And that's about it.